take a minute while I get rolling at this abstract work of art. After the talk tonight, I'm planning to speak for about 45 or 50 minutes. I am very happy to take questions, have a conversation with you, try to answer the ones I can. But I also know that question and answer can be deadly if you're not interested, and have you checking your watches if you have other things to do. So, you're free human beings, more or less, and when you need to go with no penalty at all. There's no requirement to stay, even through the talk, but particularly at the time for the questions and answers. I said to someone today, I'm planning on opening about 8 cans of worms and then running away. So that's kind of the way the talk is structured. I have also been told in the past that my lecture style is pointillist, which I think is perfect for someone who's going to talk about modern art, or art in the modern era anyway, which is to say I do have, whether they're cans of worms or points, I have a number of things I want to say. And I was thinking about the pointillist style that I've been accused of, and I guess what I would say is, if there are connections between the points, I assume you can make them, and if they're too difficult, then I can't make them, and so I'll move on. All right. It doesn't look maybe to you like an abstract painting, but all painting, with very few exceptions, is abstract. A bison weighs about 2,000 pounds. It lives and breathes. This is a flattened representation, somewhat stylized, of a bison, and therefore it is pulled away from reality, and that's the meaning of the word abstract. So we could say that it's objective, we could say that it's representational. To describe other kinds of art, we have words like non-objective and non-representational. That basket of terminology I'm going to kind of ignore tonight, and I'm really just going to focus on abstract art. And if in your minds you want to call it non-representational art or non-objective art, that's totally fine. Take a look at the next picture. So the bison was from a cave in the Spanish Pyrenees from probably 15,000 years ago or so. And in the Amazon River Basin at exactly the same time, on a cliff 8 miles long, discovered in the last 10 or 20 years, painters were also making paintings. And I chose this in particular because it's from a different part of the world, and also because this actually does incorporate abstract elements. Right? We're quite far from the early 20th century, but we're going to jump there really fast. So, some animal forms recognizable, but then strange geometric forms. They may have meant something to the artists who painted them. They probably did. That meaning is hard to discern for us, and it is also hard for us to discern the precise meaning of an abstract work of modern art. I first encountered modern art, at least in my memory, in 9th grade. I hated it, and thus began a lifelong moth-to-the-flame love-hate relationship with abstract art. And so when Anna called, and she emailed, and then we talked on the phone, and I've been thinking about this for 35 years. I'll show you a painting later in the evening that I wrote a paper as a junior in college about, because I was bound and determined to understand it. I still don't understand it, 40 years later. But I figured that in honor of Anna, I would say some things about abstract art. All right. Let me see the next slide, please. Here's a work of art that is not abstract at all. If your art is identical with its subject matter, a flag is a symbol, a painting of a flag is a symbol of exactly what the flag is a symbol of, right? In a way, Jasper Johns, who made this in around 1955, painted the first work of art that isn't abstract at all. A flag is a flag. All right. Next, please. There we go. Anyone recognize the artist? Oh, yes. Somebody got it. Good.
What'd you say?
I'll get there. Okay. I heard it. So, leaving bisons and geometric figures in caves in the Amazon aside, jumping to the early 20th century, a number of artists decided to develop and represent, you could say, a language of color and form that was not a language of color and form based in the world that we perceive with our eyes and other senses. And if you try to figure out who is the first abstract painter of the 20th century, I think you have to land here. There's a Swedish woman named Hilma af Klint. This painting is done in 1906. In a minute, I'll show you a painting done by Kandinsky in 1911. He called up his gallerist in 1935, 24 years later, and insisted that he was the first. But the record is different. This is a picture called Chaos. I think it's number 16. Yep, Chaos number 16. Next one is Chaos number 2. Same artist, same year, 1906, 1907. Seeing the painting, knowing the title, you may have some insight, but compared to looking at a bison or a bowl of fruit or a landscape, raises some questions. I want to run through a few pictures by some of the other very early abstract artists. So, next slide, please. So this is the painting that Kandinsky did in 1911, that he claimed was the first truly abstract work of art. Go ahead. This is a work by Franciszek Kupka, a Czech artist from around the same time, 1912. Go ahead. This is a painting. This was on the poster for tonight's talk by a woman named Goncharova, Natalie Goncharova, a Russian. The title is Cats, and you can kind of discern some abstracted cat activity, if not cat forms, in the work. And the next one, 1915. The white part is not part of the work of art. It is a black square. It's called Black Square, only in Russian, by the artist Kazimir Malevich. And he apologizes that it's in such bad shape, and he painted 2 or 3 others with better pigments that didn't crack so much. And the last one for now, and that's a work by Paul Klee, right? From slightly later, that's 1922. So from 1906 to 1922, you've now seen 6 artists. Every single one of them either knew Rudolf Steiner or knew of his work and the work of anthroposophy and theosophy. So interesting. Klee, who met Steiner, knew Kandinsky and worked with him, said the purpose of art is to make visible the invisible. It's kind of a new purpose for art. You could say that the artist who painted the bison 15,000 years ago was attempting in some way to make visible the invisible, but she wouldn't have said it that way. And so to say it deliberately, consciously, stating it as a reason for making painting, to make visible the invisible, signals a kind of turn in the minds of the people who are making paintings, if not all the people around them. Through history, you can appreciate, whether you have an art history degree or not, that some work looks more like what it's a painting of in the world around us, a horse or a cow or a field, and other work doesn't. If you think about your mental image of an Egyptian wall painting or a Byzantine Madonna, you realize that the artists who painted those didn't lack talent, but their interest was not specifically in a naturalistic portrayal, and therefore their interest lay elsewhere. And so I think it's fair to ask, in the early 20th century and through all of history, when artists decide not to aim at naturalism, not to aim at portraying the world we see with our eyes, what are they aiming at? When artwork is stylized to the point of abstraction, what are they looking for? What is their work a symbol of? And I think the answer to that question changes over time. The symbolic value of Egyptian wall painting is different from the symbolic value of a representation of Mary with Jesus on her lap, and it's different from early 20th century abstract art. And what I want to say, it's sort of answered in the question it asks on the poster for the talk you all came for, that modern abstraction is symbolic of the advancement of the human self beyond external authority and toward, we could say, internal authority, inner authority, which in a few minutes I'm going to try to tell you is also synonymous with inner freedom. Before I do that, I have 4 points I want to make. The first is it's really important to acknowledge the role of women in making the turn toward abstract art. Hilma af Klint was the first, Goncharova was right there, and it begins an era in human history when women begin to ascend to equal status with men in making art. And I don't want to ignore that. In fact, I set myself the goal of making sure that half the images you see tonight are by women or female artists. I don't know if I quite succeeded, but I am darn close, and I found some gems along the way. The second point I want to make is the connection of abstract art to what has been dismissed in the past as decorative art. So take a look at that Paul Klee, and then hit the next slide, and then take a look at that piece of kente cloth from Ghana from a few decades earlier. Is it possible that our friend Paul Klee noticed some African cloth? I think it's not only possible, it's likely. This isn't a cognitively abstract image, and yet it is an aesthetic object with abstract qualities. Next picture. And this is an American quilt. I do not know if the artists were white or black or brown or anything. I know that one of them was named Elmer, for whom the quilt was probably initially made. Can we read the name at the bottom? Annie. So this is Annie and Elmer's quilt. It's likely that Annie made it, but we don't know for certain, right?
Rollo.
Sorry?
Rollo.
Oh, Rollo. I didn't notice that before. Well, maybe it was a polyamorous relationship. Who knows? Or possibly Rollo was their son, or, 3 children. Yeah, all kinds of possibilities. In any event, it's quite clear also that quilts involve abstract design. And if you relegate them to the status of decorative arts, then you kind of ignore them. But if you're an artist searching for material in a new age with a new consciousness, you might see them in a new light, and so I'm inviting you to do the same. The third point I want to make, next picture please, is that there is very little doubt that the turn away from representation in art in the early 20th century has to do with the development and advancement of photography in the early to mid and then late 19th century. If photography can at least give us the sense of clear representation of the world around us, then maybe it's up to artists to find something else to do. This is one of the very first color photographs ever made. It is from 1908, right? I would say I have many students over the years who are not aware that color photography was available in 1908. There wasn't, Kodak film. You needed glass plates, you needed sophisticated equipment and sophisticated lab techniques to produce it. This was produced by a female photographer named Etheldrada Lang. Just gorgeous. Next picture, please. In addition to the representational promise of photography, I think we now, especially with computer graphics, we're more skeptical about the world in general, but we're more skeptical about the fact that a photograph can be more truthful than a painting, right? But I would say in the early 20th century, people were just developing the kind of skepticism that we're now really, really good at. But in addition to that, photography also changed the way we see the world. I'm going to take a bit of a tangent, not in my notes. And if anybody's looking for a dissertation topic, I think this is a good one because I don't think anybody's done it yet. I believe that if you go back and read novels from before the invention of movies, and then you read novels from after the invention of movies, movies have colonized our imagination. And now, even the most erudite novelists tend to write novels that are essentially glorified screenplays. When they imagine a novel, it's as if they are seeing the movie within them. And before movies existed, you couldn't do that. And so you would write a novel in a different way. Photography is an intermediate step in that process. What photography did particularly was crop the world in a way that a painting doesn't. When you set up a canvas and an easel, you choose where to put it, how to frame the subject, and how to compose the picture. You can still do that with a camera, but it's harder to do. It requires a different attitude toward what you're taking a picture of. And if you just aim and point, if you're aiming at your subject, the camera, in effect, chooses where to put the frame. And I don't believe this painting could have been done before the invention of photography. No artist prior to the invention of photography would have cropped a chair here, right? There's not really much point in it, or the chair's in the background or the side. And in fact, it's likely that this painting was made from a reference photograph that was next to the woman who made it. This is by Mary Cassatt. Little girl in a blue armchair from 1878. Not yet. Sorry. You can leave that there. That's fine, though. And so the fourth point I've already touched on, and I just want to hammer it home, and that is that art history has proceeded as if the turn toward abstraction was not, you could say, inaugurated and influenced at every turn by theosophy, anthroposophy, and Rudolf Steiner. Every one of the artists we've seen so far who was alive when Rudolf Steiner was known to be working in the early 20th century either knew him personally or knew of his work. That continues, the interest in spirituality continues long after Steiner is gone. This is a painting, I wrote, I don't know how many pages about this. Purple painting with an orange stripe down the middle. It's by Barnett Newman. The title is One-ment One. One-ment is a state of being at one, right? The source of, not the source, the goal of all religion, perhaps, or a deeper goal of religion, to be at one. Even people who don't describe themselves as religious might seek a kind of oneness. And here's Barnett Newman, who consciously, deliberately spoke about his desire to approach the sublime through his art of painting stripes. And so this painting is from 1948, the One-ment One. Next picture. This is a slight timeout. This is a painting by a woman named Alma Thomas. Look her up if you've never heard of her. She is the first black abstract artist probably in the world, if you leave decorative arts out of it. When she was a girl in the South, she was not allowed in art museums. She moved to Washington, D.C. because her father was threatened by a lynch mob. She became an art teacher, and when she retired after 35 years in the Washington, D.C. public schools, she started painting large, beautiful abstract paintings. And this is in the collection of the Smithsonian. And I would say that there's a nice effort to include her with all the sort of already well-known drinking, smoking men of that era. This is called Stormy Sea, 1958. Alma Thomas, as far as I know, never heard of Rudolf Steiner. But I would say that if you are a person who is interested in abstract art and in representing an inner life through abstract art, you have access to a kind of spirituality through your experience that you don't need the cognitive study of anthroposophy to achieve or attain, perhaps. All right, next picture, please. Anybody recognize this? Once again, like the Malevich, the white is not part of the work is just a blue rectangle. Anybody recognize the artist? It's a French theosophist named Yves Klein. This is IKB, some number, 192. 191, I was close, from 1962. IKB stands for International Klein Blue. He invented this pigment and he patented it and he used it in his paintings. He thought blue was the most spiritual of all colors. And so he painted paintings in monochrome blue of this incredibly intense hue. It doesn't reproduce in a slide, it doesn't reproduce in a book. If you see it in real life, it sucks you in a way that normal paint or pigment doesn't do. Next picture, please. Klein was a wonderful theosophist, and he believed that through the study of theosophy, he could levitate. And this is a photograph of Klein throwing himself from a balcony or a balustrade. He hit the ground horizontally and broke his wrist. And he claimed that because he had nearly broken his wrist and not damaged himself further, that he had succeeded in levitating. So, it's not a work of art, but I'm so tickled by Yves Klein that I wanted to show you this picture. And I also, since I first saw it decades ago, I've just been so intrigued by the person on the bicycle riding away and not at all aware that a lunatic theosophist is throwing himself off the building. It's possible that Klein had a person do that to stage it to make the scene more interesting as an artist. It's possible that the photographer accidentally caught it. We have no idea. All right, very good. And next one, please. Oh, here you go. Anybody recognize this artist? So gorgeous. No, it's not. It causes me pain, and yet I respect and admire it in a weird way, like all of this abstract art. This is called Felt Action by the anthroposophical artist Joseph Beuys, perhaps the most famous of all anthroposophical artists. It's a pun because the pigment was smeared on with a square of felt, and then the felt was glued to the canvas. So it's the action of felt, like felt action, but then of course it refers to feeling. So it's the action of the feeling that Beuys had in that moment, perhaps. I forget the exact story, but Joseph Beuys, I think, had been lost in the Arctic or something and saved by... Sorry? In Crimea? In the winter it must have been, though. Yeah. Oh, crashed his airplane? That's even more exciting. I have to go reread the story. Thank you. So, and was saved by felt and then used it in different ways in his art for a long time afterwards, maybe forever. Anyway, so with the possible exception of Alma Thomas, all of these are artists who, if they didn't know of Steiner, were deliberately pursuing spirituality in their art, whether it's been acknowledged in art history or not. All right, where are we? We're somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to interrupt myself at this point to talk about what is art, what is consciousness, and what is freedom, and then finish with some history in a little while. In Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, James Joyce has an astonishing scene on the streets of Dublin, waiting for a pretty girl, smoking cigarettes, talking trash, and also talking about art. I saw it referred to, and then I went and looked it up, and there's a reason James Joyce is a genius. But in there, it's quite clear that he has hidden in his art is his definition of art. And I'm going to distill it for you in a pedantic way to make it clear, but I urge you to pick up Joyce's book. And it goes like this. If you have only beauty with no meaning, that's not really possible in this world. But if you push in the direction of mere beauty or beauty alone with devoid of all meaning, Joyce calls that pornography. So some pornography is sexual, some has to do with food, some has to do with travel, some has to do with memes on your social media, I suppose. But anything that heads off in the direction of producing beauty without meaning, Joyce terms that pornography. And at the other pole, anything that strives toward meaning with no concern for beauty whatsoever, he calls that pedantry. And for Joyce, both of those sins were equally valid and relevant, and if they are temptations, they were equal temptations, temptations with equal weight. And so what is art for Joyce? It is the balance or augmentation or interpenetration or resolution of the tension between beauty and meaning. Not something that's 50% beautiful and 50% meaningful. That's not how polarities work. One of my students long ago dubbed me the polarity bear. She's sitting right here. Thank you. And for the next little while, I'm going to be presenting a number of polarities for you, and that's the first one. What is art? From the point of view of trying to understand art as a polarity, it is the resolution of the tension between beauty and meaning. And for Joyce, it's quite clear that true art produces what he calls aesthetic arrest. It does not try to move or manipulate you. Of course, it tries to create movement within you, but that's a different story. Things that move or manipulate you are advertisements and political propaganda and things like that, right? You think of a pharmaceutical ad. It has the appearance of beauty. The words or text or voiceover has the appearance of meaning, but the actual goal and the effect on the world is to manipulate you into desiring a product, right? And so every true polarity has two poles. They exist as ideas, as extreme ideas, although you can't force your way all the way over to one pole without dragging a tiny bit of the other with you. Fortunately, that would be terrible for the world. They have a resolution, and then they also have a kind of fallen or unresolved state. And so Joyce's imagination of art as the resolution of the tension between beauty and meaning, I find astonishing and beautiful in itself. And I'm going to come back to it in a minute in a different way. What about consciousness? Well, in a room full of mostly anthroposophists, we all know that consciousness is the resolution of the tension between perceiving and thinking, between perception and cognition, right? And if those two are allowed not to produce actual thinking, then you get conventional thinking. Owen Barfield, my dear friend whom I never met, was enormously concerned that we spend much of our lives involved with sort of repeating the conventions of perceiving and thinking without ever actually or rarely rousing ourselves actually to do it for ourselves, right? And so we can think of consciousness in a polar relationship between cognition and perception, or thinking and perceiving. We know, this is getting toward a point I want to make later on, we know that we can live more toward one pole or the other. We expect that medical doctors and scientists, to do their work well, will live more toward the cognitive pole, that artists may choose to live more toward the perceptive pole, although I think we'll leave that in doubt for the moment. Certainly children live more in their perception, and as they grow, and especially as we educate them, they move closer to the center and possibly toward the cognitive pole. And so the resolution of a polarity doesn't just exist as a static, dead thing. It exists as a living movement. Let's leave it at that for now. And then we also know that consciousness, not only can it exist closer to one pole or the other, that it can exist in wakefulness, in complete alertness. It can be dreamy and unfocused and uncertain, and it can also be dead asleep, right? It's still there, it's just not acknowledged or effective, let's say. And the last thing to say about consciousness is that, fortunately for us, it arises intuitively of our meeting with the world. And that begins even in utero, right? We distinguish ourselves from the world, or we begin to distinguish ourselves from the world, and in separating in that way, our consciousness lights up. Are we ready for a little bit of light?
Yeah.
I might have to see my notes from time to time. Thanks, Anna.
What's that?
It's good for me. Everybody? You can still see. I'm glad we stopped on this one. Not really. All right. Let's talk about something a little more challenging. Is it possible to understand freedom? I'm going to say specifically inner freedom, although I think what I have to say applies to outer freedom as well. Is it possible to understand freedom in a polar relationship? Before I do that, though, I do want to distinguish what I'm going to call inner freedom. I'm not alone in calling it this, and what I'm going to call outer freedom. Outer freedom is like having a choice of which toothpaste to buy, or freedom to carry a weapon, or something like that. Inner freedom I'm going to spend a little more time with. I can tell you from teaching high school, the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn is disappearing from history too rapidly. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Nobel Prize-winning writer and historian who was imprisoned in the Soviet Union and survived. Wrote about his experience in a prison camp hospital in a book called Cancer Ward. Wrote about his experience in prison camp in a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, the only book published in Russia during his life. It's okay, but his magnum opus, his greatest work, is 3 volumes called The Gulag Archipelago.
What?
The Gulag Archipelago. The Gulag is the prison camp, and he imagines the prison camps spread across all of Mother Russia as a sea of islands. An archipelago is a chain of islands, right? Each volume, 1, 2, 3, we know the sales figures, at least in English, and each volume was purchased less than the one before it, and yet I think the 3rd volume is the most valuable. And the first chapter of the 3rd volume is called The Ascent in English translation. And it describes what can happen to your soul if you find yourself with all external freedom removed, to the point where your life or your death is not even a matter of your own free choice. And in a situation in which he had to renounce his claim to his own life, let alone nutrition, exercise, waking and sleeping, he discovered within himself what I think we can only call inner freedom. So what is inner freedom? It's the freedom of your mind that resides or remains when everything else is potentially stripped from you. You and I, the wealthiest nation that's ever existed, can access it through our imagination, perhaps. I don't recommend, for example, creating a new kind of Waldorf school where you remove all freedom from humans in the hope that they will develop inner freedom. That's not the way that works. I want to read you, though, something that Solzhenitsyn, if he's known only as a dissident writer, only as a survivor of the prison camp, only as a thinker about the state of his soul in the prison camp, we miss part of Solzhenitsyn. And so I want to read a couple of paragraphs regarding beauty. This is part of his meditation or his thinking while he's imprisoned. One day, Dostoevsky threw out the enigmatic remark, "Beauty will save the world." What sort of a statement is that? For a long time, I considered it mere words. How could that be possible? When in bloodthirsty history did beauty ever save anyone from anything? Ennobled, uplifted, yes, but whom has it saved? There is, however, a certain peculiarity in the essence of beauty, a peculiarity in the status of art. Namely, the convincingness of a true work of art is completely irrefutable, and it forces even an opposing heart to surrender. It is possible to compose an outwardly smooth and elegant political speech, a headstrong article, a social program, or a philosophical system on the basis of both a mistake and a lie. What is hidden, what is distorted, will not immediately become obvious. That applies to pharmaceutical ads, perhaps, to the existence of the Soviet Union from one point of view, to the existence of capitalism in the United States, or I should say so-called capitalism. What we have isn't really capitalism anyway. Whole tangent, Adam Smith was writing in a pre-industrial world. His ideas didn't apply 30 years after he wrote them, and nobody paid attention. All right. Back to Solzhenitsyn. Then a contradictory speech. So you've got one political system or philosophy based on a mistake, Then a contradictory speech, article, program, a differently constructed philosophy rallies in opposition, and all just as elegant and smooth, and once again it works, temporarily, which is why such things are both trusted and mistrusted. But a work of art bears within itself its own verification. I think that's what Joyce means by aesthetic arrest. Conceptions which are devised or stretched and do not stand being portrayed in images, they all come crashing down, appear sickly and pale, convince no one. But those works of art which have scooped up the truth and presented it to us as a living force, I'll get to that in a little bit, they take hold of us, compel us, and nobody ever, not even in ages to come, will appear to refute them. So perhaps that ancient trinity of truth, goodness, and beauty is not simply an empty, faded formula as we thought in the days of our self-confident, materialistic youth. If the tops of these three trees converge, truth, beauty, goodness, as the scholars maintained, but the too blatant, too direct stems of truth and goodness are crushed, cut down, not allowed through, then perhaps the fantastic, unpredictable, unexpected stems of beauty will push through and soar to that very same place, and in doing so will fulfill the work of all three. In that case, Dostoevsky's remark, "Beauty will save the world," was not a careless phrase, but a prophecy. Thank you. So, if we want to conceive freedom as a polarity, how can we conceive it? I'm going to say that the poles that generate freedom potentially are morality on the one side and creativity on the other side. And I can tell you that I wrestled with this for probably 10 years before I found another writer, another thinker who had solved it for me. And I'm going to read to you from his work now. He's a developmental psychologist. He was a student of Jean Piaget. He was actually director of the Piaget Institute for a brief while after Piaget's death. He's now deceased. He died in 2008. His name was Howard Gruber. He spent his life studying human creativity, not just in art. His life's work was on Charles Darwin as a creative human being. Creativity for Gruber involves hard work, aiming at insight, years of work with no necessary guarantee of success. A glimpse of insight, the aha moment that we focus on too much without paying attention to the work that comes before to develop ourselves as musicians or mathematicians or philosophers or whatever it is. Let me just take a time out to say, unless there are mathematicians in the room, it could be that all of the mathematical truths of the entire universe are raining down on our heads right this moment. But without the preparatory work to be able to perceive them and to turn them into something useful for the world, it won't matter. So, creativity involves hard work, then a little glimpse of insight, and then you have a glimpse of insight that yields a new symphony, and you spend months tearing your hair out to put it down on a score that somebody could play. Or you spend months writing a mathematical proof that occurred to you in an instant while you were stepping from the ground to the bus, right? All right. That's a tiny glimpse into Gruber's world. Here's Gruber on creativity and morality. You ready? Our conceptions of creativity and morality are intertwined in a number of ways. At once we see that the indispensable middle term between creativity and morality is freedom. We can hardly speak of a moral act if the actor has no choice. Creative work also requires inner freedom. Creative work must be in some ways kindred to the world. If not the world as it is, then the world as it will or might be. It flows out of that world and it flows back into it. Thus the creative person, to carry out the responsibility to self, the responsibility for inner integrity, must also in some ways be responsive to the world. And if you hear that and then you remember, some of us read recently in Steiner's Philosophy of Freedom that for Steiner, inner freedom is the ability to obey ourselves, not the dictates of the outer world. Sounds a lot like Gruber. I mean, Gruber came later, but same idea. the responsibility to self. And so with the rise of the idea of freedom, external freedom, political freedom, the freedom that capitalism promises, we can see external authority falling away. And so it leads to one interesting point for art historians, which is that, and people who go to museums, which is that no one can actually define or describe what art is any longer. Because if you try to tell me what art is and what art is not, then I'm going to do this. Next slide, please. I'm going to buy a urinal at a hardware store. I'm going to sign a fake name to it, and I'm going to send it to your gallery. And that's what Marcel Duchamp did in 1917 for a show where the arrangers announced that no artwork would be refused, right? And the history of, you could say, prank art. It would be great to teach a course in prank art someday, but the history of prank art continues. Damien Hirst preserved a shark in formaldehyde. That's his art, right? Some of it is blasphemous, some of it is scatological. This is scatological, right? But there you go. So you tell me what art is, I can instantly figure out something that I will call art because external authority has no weight any longer. It's remarkably freeing. And yet it's not kind of really an accident that the first work that points in this direction, not so abstract, more bathroom humor, right? And so when freedom blooms and blossoms, on the one hand, it holds the promise with inner freedom of a resolution of morality and creativity. Formerly, artists were not necessarily particularly moral people. I'm not sure they are currently. I believe in the future they might be. Think about Caravaggio, killed a guy over a prostitute during a tennis game, but painted some of the most beautiful paintings of the Baroque period. And so I think in some ways, going back to our theme, which is abstract art in the early 20th century, one way to make sense of it is to think of it as the product of a very talented, very smart kid in a candy store. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry it's so small. You may recall in the 1993 hit Groundhog Day, Bill Murray has to live the same day over and over and over and over. And before he recognizes the ethical and creative possibilities of his existence on Groundhog Day, when he is merely enjoying the freedom, he goes to a diner and he eats and drinks exactly what he likes with no concern for his health because he knows he'll wake up the next day without a heart attack, without indigestion, without a weight gain, right? And so this picture is meant to show sort of the joy of the discovery of freedom with no recognition of the consequences of freedom. All right. To finish this section, I don't want to interrupt this because it's recording. Can someone tell me the time? Do you have the time, Paul?
8:21.
All right. And when did we actually start?
7:35.
Okay.
7:40.
Good. We're on track. I've done this before. We'll make it to the end. But I do want to end the section on freedom on a much more serious note. This is a recognition that I had in my own life, I think about 5 years ago. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story. In the Q&A you can ask about it. It's not that interesting, but it was helpful to me. But the insight that I earned was this. I certainly want to be free. I want outer freedom, and perhaps as an anthroposophist, maybe because I'm old, even more, I want inner freedom. And I realized that if I want those things, I have to allow you to have them. Even if what you do with them annoys me. Even if I think you're doing it wrong, right? If I want to be free, I have to allow you to be free. And so I developed a one-question test for inner freedom. It goes like this. How inwardly free am I? I am as inwardly free as I allow you to be. I could end there, but I'm not gonna. We have some more pictures to look at and some more things to consider. I actually feel like in some of the tangents I've covered some of the points I had for this late in the talk. So let's leave it, let's skip a tiny bit and let's go to this. Consciousness itself has an evolution and a history. That's worth a book right there. Many books. I think the progression that I'm looking for, or that we're looking for in history, goes something like this. Consciousness evolves and changes to a point at which we can call it self-consciousness, or perhaps a new kind of self-consciousness. Next slide, please. Imagine that there are something like 10,000 years of human history, and as far as we know, on the globe, no artist decided to look in a pond, look in a mirror, look in a glass, and make a painting of himself or herself. Starting in the early 1400s, artists did this at first one at a time, then by the dozens, then by the thousands. Now we have middle school kids drawing self-portraits, right? As far as we know, this is the first identifiable self-portrait. This is Jan van Eyck from 1433. Next picture, please. You may not know this young woman. This is Catharina van Hemmesen from 1548, the first self-portrait by a woman. And the text reads, I, Catharina van Hemmesen, have painted myself, 1548, her aged 20. Right? A statement of self. Next picture, please. And this is a self-portrait by Sophonisba Anguissola. Have any of you ever known a Sophonisba? That's a name we should bring back. You can call her Sophie and nobody will know. In any event, this is from 1554, and it's really, truly, probably the second self-portrait by a woman. Self-portraits, we could go on and on. I actually took out some Rembrandts, which I love, but I'm going to move on. Self-portraits are a signal of, or a symbol of, or a sign of a change in consciousness from, you could say, mere consciousness of the world to a new kind of self-consciousness of the world. And I think that that's a necessary first step. Before you can have any kind of inner freedom, you have to have a self that is capable of being inwardly free. And so I look at these changes 500 or 600 years prior to the changes we're talking about in abstract art as a necessary precursors. And you can follow the sequence of self-portraits right up, even through the period of abstraction to the current. I took out a self-portrait by David Hockney, one of my favorite artists, made on an iPad. Self-portrait by Alice Neal, whose grandchildren went to the Steiner School in New York City and lived in Harlem and has a show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art right now and is finally getting the recognition she deserves. Because of knowing her grandchildren at summer camp years and years ago, I knew about her as an artist, and otherwise I might well not have. All right, last topic for the talk tonight. I'm going to switch the order for my notes. You ever notice that even though Rudolf Steiner, anthroposophy, theosophy, spiritual seeking influenced so many, I'm going to say most of the artists who developed the turn toward abstraction in art, that Steiner himself never painted abstractly? So interesting. So I pondered that, and here's what I want to say. I'm going to save a picture of Steiner's for the end. I wonder if, and I mean this, I'm not being rhetorical. I truly wonder if the artists who did not make the turn to abstraction, but who were interested in developing themselves toward what, for tonight, we're going to call inner freedom, if one of the things they didn't encounter pretty darn quickly could be called life. I think it relates to Solzhenitsyn's quote that I read, and I think it relates to artists who are capable of painting not just what they see, not just what they feel, but what they experience as the life of the world, for lack of a better term. So next picture, please. I think he's one of the first. Vincent van Gogh. This is from the last year of his life. It's a hospital called St. Paul's. It's a lesser-known painting, but it's one of my favorites. In real life, the red, yellow, and blue and green are more striking than they are in the reproduction. But the oneness of his brushwork, the aliveness of his brushwork, to me, suggests that perhaps, he didn't say it in so many words, but perhaps he is perceiving and trying to show us not just what we see with our eyes as using our object consciousness, not just what we perceive in ourselves in a sort of subjective way, but what happens when the inner and the outer unite and perceive life. Next picture, please. Another artist I wonder about in this regard is Khayyam Soutine. This painting is from 1939, portentous year in the 20th century. A Russian Jew who moved to Paris, or to France at any rate.
What's his name?
Soutine, S-O-U-T-I-N-E. Soutine was a theosophist. Next one, please. Only known Canadian in the show tonight. Emily Carr.
I'm just going to try Justin.
Yep. Thanks.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's good. Emily Carr, the resolution of the image may not be very good. Emily Carr was born on Vancouver Island and grew up in British Columbia, went to Paris and studied, found it unsatisfactory, but came back and met some theosophists in Canada and developed a mature style that I think speaks to the same kind of insight that Soutine and Van Gogh and others, perhaps less well known, were pushing toward. And since we're all now intimate acquaintances and friends, I can say that when I say they are trying to paint life, anthroposophists maybe too quickly call that to paint etheric existence, right? Fancy name for life. What did Emily Carr say about her work? She says, "I was not ready for abstraction. I clung to earth and her dear shapes, her density, her herbage, her juice. I wanted her volume, and I wanted to hear her throb." Beautiful, 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 beautiful. And so, last picture for tonight. So this is by the non-abstract, representational, highly mediocre, artless, techniqueless Rudolf Steiner. I dare to call it the way it is. Rudolf Steiner did not have a lot of artistic talent. That doesn't mean he didn't have tremendous insight. But, any of us who have taught teenagers knows that every once in a while you get a 12 or a 13-year-old, 12-year-old or a 13-year-old who is sort of more skilled with a pencil or a brush. Is that fair to say? I'm not trying to denigrate Steiner because I have a point I want to make. For Steiner, it's quite clear technique was beside the point, right? Technique can be taught. Technique can mask a host of deficiencies. If you simply perceive and put a color where a color should be without worrying about technique, there's a kind of direct honesty to the work that gets you around the fact that you may not have a great deal of talent. So, Steiner never abandoned representation, even though he influenced many, many artists who became abstract artists. And I should say, he left them in freedom to do so. He gave them advice when they asked for advice, but he never said, "You should paint like me." And I would say that he extended representation in his work artlessly to include his inner life, one that we know, most of us know, he claimed mirrored with precision the outer world that we know so well. My inner life, I don't believe for a second, is as clear as Rudolf Steiner's inner life. If I made a painting like this, it would be a copy of Steiner. It wouldn't be my own honest perception of my inner life. Can I say that? And so, not Bill Murray in a diner celebrating freedom, not playful personal explorations of color and form in abstraction, but a representation that aims at what is true of one world that we find on the other side of the subject-object divide, a world that has recognizable form, but one that is also imbued with the riches of a carefully tended inner life. And so I think all of these final artists, Van Gogh, Soutine, I'm guessing, I don't know, Emily Carr, Rudolf Steiner, I wonder if they perceived life, and in their perception of life, were able to bring a oneness that many of us have been searching for a long time. Thanks. That's all I have to say tonight.